as a distributor community at large, we want to hear from you about the investors' experience. Because what is happening is the investors at large depend on the distributor community, and we go to them with different schemes, debt and equity. And at the end of the day, when they see the returns, they are not very, very happy in the last 18 months, whether it is debt or equity. We can say a lot of benchmark, we are beating the benchmark, everything is fine. But they have only one benchmark. They know State Bank of India fixed deposit interest rate is 6.5 or 7 today. So they are asking, when it is giving 6.5 and the government is giving me senior citizens 7.5 and 8, and you are talking about some other benchmark which is not acceptable to them at all. So as a distributor community, how do we go about in handling this issue, both debt and equity?
That's a very good question. While I do agree that markets have been really, really challenging, there is always this concern with investors about returns not being adequate. But let me point out the last 3 to 4 years, like I said, has been, or 5 years has been extremely challenging for India. Right? There have been a lot of volatility, but having said this, most equity funds have done exceedingly well. Muddling through all of this. I'll just give you an example, I was just looking at some numbers. If you take the large and mid-cap category, the 2-year return is about 12%. Okay, a shade under 2, average. I'm saying category average is a little below 12. The 3-year return is about 15. The 5-year return, which is really when all these things happened, right, is about 10.5. So effectively, while 10.5 as a number, if you say long-term investing, and this is average, I'm not talking taking the best fund in the category or whatever. This is average return. Has been reasonably good, and especially at the time when interest rates were falling, right? If you compare that, the average rate of return that any investor would have got, I think it's been pretty decent given where the situation is and the circumstances are. So, in terms of investor behavior, I think what is important is the right asset allocation, and that's where the distributor community comes into play. There is always this tendency to chase the best asset class. It may not be the best asset class for the customer. I think if we shift our focus away from returns and move more into asset allocation and also what is appropriate for the investor. As a mutual fund, we have these broad categories and every fund manager would try to beat the benchmark, etc., be disciplined and all of those wonderful things. But the key role is of the distributor to figure out what's best for that investor and then provide him or her with the right asset allocation mix. I hope I have answered that question.
I think what is happening now is you are putting the ball back to the distributor to select the best and have a good asset allocation place. That's fairly a good one. The second thing which we are hearing from the investor community at large is they are also, all the AMCs are launching a lot of passive funds now.
Yeah.
So now we want to know how to go about in allocating passive funds to the investors at large. And what do you think is the roadmap for passive funds as far as India is concerned, and why suddenly we find AMCs launching so many passive funds?
That's again a very interesting question. So if you look at the journey of passive funds, globally it's caught on quite significantly because the alpha generating opportunities in most of the developed worlds are limited. And because of the low cost structure, that's created a lot of buzz and momentum. Even in India, because the last 2 or 3 years have been a little patchy or challenging for many of the mutual fund, active mutual funds, I think there is a little bit of trend towards passive. And I think passives are here to stay. And I think it will be a sizable proportion over the next 5 or 10 years, is what my reckoning is. On the flip side, I'm not even suggesting that the alpha generating opportunities have gone away. I think India is one of the best markets which can actually create alpha, right? What is happening is actually there is a new category of investors. It's not that the existing category of investors from mutual funds are, active mutual funds are shifting. There might be some who are perhaps unhappy with the performance or whatever. But there is this new young generation which probably is looking at this entire passive category. They don't want to be in FDs because post-tax returns and all of that is not very attractive for them. They don't want to get into the active business because that involves a lot of time and energy in terms of figuring out, which is the best fund, etc., etc. So that's the category which is looking at this area, which will perhaps give them about 11-12% CAGR over the next 10, 15 years, right? So for them, this becomes a very, very important category. So it's a very new set of investors that are looking at this category. Perhaps market share of FDs over a period of time could probably come down, and a fairly significant amount of money can get into passives. But for active mutual funds, I think that's still a big market out there. There are still investors who would want that alpha generation to happen within their portfolios.
So what do you think should be the proportion? Do you have any proportion in place, or do you have any suggestion of passive funds in a investor's portfolio? So,
I wouldn't be able to answer that right away because each individual will have their own risk return metrics, their risk appetite, etc. That's the reason in my first answer I said, the distributor's role is not just figuring out which fund is giving the highest return and giving it to the investor, rather becoming an advisor, right? That's called the advisor alpha, if you know what I'm trying to say, right? But think about it, passive funds today account for about 8%, in 2018 was about 8% of the total equity. Today it's closer to 25%. That's a big shift, right? So I think it's a very serious business, and my suggestion would be, for every single advisor to map out the investor profile and suggest schemes, because there's nothing called one size fits all kind of a formula where you say, okay, 60% active, 20% passive, and within active, 50% large cap, etc., etc. So, every investor would be different depending on their age profile, their risk appetite, etc. So, I think it's going to become a very, very involved business compared to what it was a few years ago.
Now, coming to the thematic area, a lot of funds are now being launched by AMCs, and some investors had a good experience in few of the thematic areas in the past. But do you think, because you also in your presentation you were saying about the capex and infrastructure and so many things are going, do you think thematic has got a place in investors' portfolio?
I think it does, in the sense that, you pick up any theme. Typically in a diversified fund, the reason for running a diversified fund is that you kind of smoothen out the volatility of the various sectors, right, and the companies. Whereas in a thematic fund, you are betting on a particular sector, right? The cycles of a lot of these sectors generally tend to be long, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So only an investor who understands these cycles should typically invest in thematic funds. Otherwise, I've seen a typical tendency of people, whenever there is a sector which is in the limelight, everybody rushing into that sector, and then usually you end up investing at the top, and then the sector's cycle turns, and then you have to wait for 3 years, and everyone gets terribly disappointed. If you're willing to wait for 3 to 5 years in a equity mutual fund, I think for thematics, that number should be even longer because it takes a long time for the sector cycles. So if you want to play multiple cycles over 2 or 3 cycles, you need to stay invested for over 10 years. So I think thematics have a place, provided the understanding of the investor of that particular sector is good, and that he or she is willing to stay for the long term. When I say long term, at least 8 to 10 years.
So your long-term definition of an equity fund has gone to 5-6 years, and thematic has gone to 10 years, is it?
It was, so equity has always been, if you see, if you look at equity cycles, over a 10-year period, you will find, pick any 10 years, you will find, couple of years the markets won't do well. It'll underperform, it'll have negative returns. 3 years, it'll do extraordinarily well. 3-4 years. 4 years, it won't do anything. So now you answer me, I'm not going to tell you which are those 3 years because I don't know, right? So in that situation, you have to stay invested. And I think part of the dilemma of a lot of investors, you asked the first question, is that the switching from one end to the other, one asset class to the other, one particular a mutual fund to the other because somebody is doing badly and somebody is doing well. One need to kind of sit back and say, okay, what is this money? Is this money, do I require this money over the next 5 years or 10 years? Only then come into equity. If I'm going to need the money in the next 12 to 18 months, don't come to equities. That's not the right place. Because these cycles eventually are longer. And if you hit it at the wrong end, so, there have been studies which have said that even if you entered the market at the peak of the cycle and then remained invested for, say, 8-10 years, you would have still made a great return over a period of time, above any other asset class. So I think the important takeaway is to stay invested. Don't try and chase fashion, right? Investing should be a habit and not a fashion, right? And remain long term because there is some sense in remaining long term because these cycles take long. It's not because mutual funds want you to be invested for long term, right? It is because to make a decent, reasonable return in the markets, you need to spend that kind of time.
See, the seasoned distributors who are present here, as we always say that unless your time frame is 5 to 6 years, don't even come to equity. We don't advise any of the investor to come into equity unless the time frame is 5 to 6 years. So based on that. But now you also mentioned 3-4 years, there won't be any return. That's what we are following. The problem is hand-holding the investors of those period when nothing happens and they don't see any return.
That's correct.
So it is becoming a great challenge for us. Yeah. So that's how we are facing the real challenge here. But I think the message is very clear that we need to stay put for a longer duration and we need to get the best benefit out of equity over a longer duration. That's what...
No, I completely agree with that. It's not easy to hold investors focused, right? Stay focused when during those dull periods or periods of negative returns. But think about it, mistakes, both on our side as well as in terms of investors' side, happens during extremes of markets. In between, we are all champions, right? In a bull market, a lot of mistakes get committed because people get overexcited, they overcommit. And in bear markets, there is severe padding, right? As long as you can control your emotions at both the ends of the spectrum, I think you would be fine.
You also want to advise this community what is going right and what is going wrong?
In terms of?
For the distributed community at large, what we are doing right and what we are not doing right?
No, I think it's communication, it's transparency, and expectation management. As long as you're able to do that, and and as much as possible, try and stay away from personal biases. Many times, the business drives your asset class choice. Which is why I said the easiest thing to do for anybody is, what would I do if this was my money? That's the question every single person need to ask, right? Before recommending a particular asset class. So in the longer term, what happens is you have investors who are, loyal to you, right? They will stay with you no matter what because they look up to you for the right advice. And your advice does not have any emotions, and your advice is transparent, and you are doing it in the best interest of the investor.
So thank you very much, sir. We really enjoyed your
Thank you
answer.
so much.